Nobody likes Miss Bingley. She is a mean girl. She hurt Jane Bennet, and that's pretty much unforgivable. But have you ever wondered why Miss Bingley is a mean girl? Well, that's what we're diving in here today. What Miss Bingley teaches us about Jane Austen's Regency world and fashionable high society. So if you want to learn all about that, then definitely stay tuned for today's video. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. Why is Miss Bingley such a mean girl? This is a question that I'm sure has a lot of answers involving childhood trauma and so many other issues that probably result in her bullying behavior. But of course, a major underlying cause too is her social aspirations of being part of the elite ton in London that sets all of the fashions. We recently went into what it meant to be part of this fashionable elite, but today we're going to break down exactly how to become part of that elite. Like, what does it take to be truly fashionable, and is Miss Bingley actually living up to these requirements? So we will be breaking down the steps of how to become a lady of fashion. First up, be born into the right family. So, as we know from previous discussions on the social order in the Regency era, a lot of your life was determined by what family you were born into and their status. Now, of course, the core group of people of fashion was those that were high-born. Preferably, you'd be born into a family with some sort of title. As one author put it, people of quality, for this is the term by which they designate the title gentry, can never be out of fashion. Now, the title gentry mentioned here probably includes both those titles of nobility and also those with knight and baronet titles. Check out How to Name an English Lord if you need more clarification on this. But basically, if you came from a family with a title, you had a much more secure place in the group of the people of fashion. Now, of course, people of fashion were kind of a fickle group who would let people in and kick them out at will. However, those that came from quality, as they called them, were sort of pre-qualified from birth. They got let in much easier and they stayed in much more securely than those that did not. Now, of course, birth was a pre-qualification. However, you still determined by your behavior if you got into the club or not. So a great example of this is Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Is she a lady of fashion? Because she certainly is a member of the title gentry. No, she is not. Because instead of partying in London, she has decided to go tell her clergyman to put shelves in his closet. That's the most unfashionable thing you could do. I'm sorry, she's not getting into this club. Now, while these people of quality were sort of the core bedrock of people of fashion, and they were the most secure in it, other people were let in or kicked out at will, depending on, how the people of quality and people of fashion were feeling about it. So let's actually look at Miss Bingley, because she is one of those that was not born into a titled gentry family. However, she is definitely within the periphery of this group. While she's definitely not at the core of it, she's got, a little headway in there. How did she do that, and what are her qualifications? The book describes her background as they were of a respectable family in the north of England, a circumstance more deeply impressed on their memories than that their brother's fortune and their own had been acquired by trade. So here Jane Austen describes the Bingleys as coming from a respectable family in the north of England. Now, of course, we don't know exactly what Austen meant, but there's a good chance that meant a gentry landed family. However, at some point, that land was no longer in this set of Bingleys because their money, instead of coming from land, had to come from trade. One possible explanation for this could be that their father was a younger son. So, for example, if their grandfather owned land, was a respectable member of the gentry, and had multiple sons, his oldest son would have inherited the estate, and the Bingley's father would have had to find an occupation in order to provide for his family. Now, of course, you know from previous videos that the gentry really preferred gentlemanly occupations for their younger sons, such as the church, the law, or the military. However, a good number of younger sons also did go into trade. Now, if you've seen my video on marrying up and social climbing, then you're familiar that there were better lines of trade to go into, such as large-scale dealing in luxuries. So, if the Bingley's father had been able to go into large-scale trade, then that would explain how he was able to make enough money to get a fortune for his son and his daughters to have to no longer be in trade. Basically, the Bingleys are in this weird, awkward social position where they come from good family, but they had to dirty their hands in trade for at least one generation, and now they're trying to re-social climb back up out of that and retransition into being landed gentry, and that's one of the reasons Mr. Bingley is supposed to buy an estate so that he can complete this retransitioning and social climbing for the family. Again, if all of this stuff about social class and social climbing and younger sons is confusing, go watch all my other videos. We've talked about this so much, but I must move on to the important point then, that the Bingleys are in this awkward position of re-social climbing up into the gentry. While Miss Bingley does have enough money and other things like we'll talk about in a second to qualify to be a lady of fashion, she's in a very insecure place, right? She does not come from a quality family. She's not the daughter of a landed gentleman, even if she might be the granddaughter of one. She's not very secure in her social status. And I think this leads into one of the reasons Miss Bingley is a mean girl. She's insecure. And you know something that would give her so much more security? Something that could really cement her as a mainstay of fashionable society. Perhaps marrying a gentleman that has 10,000 a year, is the grandson of an earl, and has a beautiful estate in Derbyshire. I think that would really help her out. So Miss Bingley feels super insecure about her family background in the Regency era, but do you know what she would feel extra insecure about in 2025? Her personal data being sold on the internet. And that is where our video sponsor, Incogni, comes in. So, have you ever searched yourself on the internet? Were you shocked by the amount of information it has about you, from your birthday to who you're related to where you live? That is a lot out there just for scammers and identity thieves and stalkers to see. But have you ever wondered, where does the internet get that information about you? The answer is data brokers. Data brokers collect your data and sell it to people, and those people don't always have the best of intentions. Now, that's why I love this video sponsor, Incogni. Incogni tracks down and removes your personal information online. It's very simple to sign up for, and once you do, its automated system starts taking down your data from hundreds of data brokers. Now, something else I love is that if you are later searching online for yourself and you see a website that still has your data, you can do a custom removal where you ask for that data to also be taken down and they will get on it. So if you want to take back your personal data online, then definitely check out Incogni. Use my code Dashwood for 60% off an annual plan and go to incogni.com/Dashwood to learn more. Now, back to the video. So this takes us to step number 2, which is be very rich. Money was essential. Perhaps you didn't have the greatest birth. That's okay. But if you don't have money, then there's no way on the planet you are getting into people of fashion. Now, while this was a social indicator thing and net worth and self-worth was very intertwined in this era, it was also a practical concern. Living the fashionable lifestyle was expensive. Not only did you have to keep up with ever-changing clothing fashion that cost quite a bit of money. You had to be going to a constant round of parties and throwing parties yourself, and my whole Regency era marriage season video. And basically, it was an expensive life. You had to live in a fashionable neighborhood. You had to have enough servants. Money was important. In fact, you needed to spend so much money that you always spent more than you actually had. It does not matter if you were making $10,000 a year or $100,000 a year, you were going to be spending more than that just to be fashionable. And it's very interesting because Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst qualify on this point. The book describes their financial backstory this way. Miss Bingley and her sister had a fortune of £20,000, so were in the habit of spending more than they ought, and of associating with people of rank, and were, therefore, in every respect, entitled to think well of themselves and meanly of others. So not only does Miss Bingley have a very good fortune that allows her to live this fashionable lifestyle, but she spends more than she ought, which now at first might sound like Jane Austen is just pointing out that she's a bad money manager. But in reality, if you look at this sentence, it is listed as one of the qualifications that allows her to think well of herself and meanly of others. Because actually spending more than you ought was a sign of being fashionable and elite. This wasn't a, oh, she's a bad money manager moment. It was like, oh, she's living that lifestyle. And because she's living that lifestyle, it makes her feel like she's superior to other people. Which, if you think about it, is kind of funny to feel superior to other people because you're going into debt. But alas, that's how high society London saw things. Step 3, be polished and beautiful. So during this time period, women needed to be polished, accomplished, and lovely. Now, of course, how did you get your daughters to be accomplished? Well, you sent them to a fashionable school, which is exactly what happened to Miss Bingley and her sister. The book says that they had been educated in one of the first private seminaries in town. Now, we've talked about boarding schools before, but basically this is where you would send your daughters to be taught by the best masters, and they would come back very refined and polished, and also slightly morally corrupt was the general viewpoint of the era. So this was another thing that was indicating to Regency readers, Miss Bingley, not only is she fashionable, she went to a fashionable school, which would have corrupted her morals. There are red flags here. Now, of course, what would these schools teach? Well, Miss Bingley sums it up herself later when talking about an accomplished woman when she says, "Oh, certainly, no one can be really esteemed accomplished who does not greatly surpass what is usually met with. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages to deserve the word. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her dress and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved." And of course, we know while Miss Bingley is listing off these accomplishments that she considers herself as, having quite a few of them. Meanwhile, something else she does have is she's beautiful. The book says that her and her sister were rather handsome. So basically, Miss Bingley actually qualifies on this with flying colors. But does she have step number 4? Step 4, live in London during the winter. And by winter, we mean at least half the year. So the high society of Regency era thought there were only 2 seasons, more or less. There was summer and winter lasted for part of fall, all of winter, and most of spring, and even kind of into summer, depending on when the fashionables decided to break court in London and head out to their country estates. But basically, they hung out a lot with each other in London, and that is where fashions were set. That is the place you needed to be if you wanted to be anybody. But not only that, my friends, not only did you need to be in London during the winter, you needed to be in the fashionable part of London, because all parts of London are not created equal. And where does Miss Bingley stay? Well, what were the fashionable neighborhoods? Let's see. According to one Regency writer, Grosvenor Square, St. James's Street, and Portland Place are mellifluous sounds and picturesque objects that please the eye as well as the ear of the fashionable ton. So these fashionable neighborhoods were all concentrated in the West End of London, and that was the place you needed to stay to be anybody. And where does Miss Bingley stay? Well, the book tells us that when they went to London, they meant to dine that day in Grosvenor Street, where Mr. Hurst had a house. So Miss Bingley and the Hursts did, in fact, live in Grosvenor Street in London during the winter. So they are qualifying. Step 5, socialize with the right people. So once you are there in London during the winter, fashionable part of town, you have enough money, you come from not the worst background, what you need to do is start hanging out with that quality, with the people who are members of people of fashion, and very secure ones at that, if possible. Now, of course, how do you do that? How do you make friends with these people? That's actually a great and brilliant question that I think social climbers were trying to find an answer to for years. But for the Bingleys, one way that they could have possibly made all these connections and all of these high-class friends is from school. When they went to those fancy ladies' prep schools, that wasn't just to get them super accomplished, that was also a great networking moment. Likewise, when Mr. Bingley went to university, another great networking moment. You know who was terrible at networking? Mr. Collins. In fact, the book notes this about his time at university. It says, though he belonged to one of the universities, he had merely kept the necessary terms without forming at it any useful acquaintance. Mr. Collins is just a terrible socializer. But I don't think that's news to anybody. However, you know who would not have squandered their time going to school with the children of the rich and the powerful? The Bingley sisters. So that is one possible way they could have had these connections so they could go to the right balls and the right dinners to get at least on the fringes of the people of fashion. Step 6, have the correct priorities. Now, what did you need to prioritize as a member of the elite fashionable? Well, luxury, pleasure, enjoyment, and more or less acting like the moral code that applies to everyone else does not apply to you. So the fashionables were known for wild gambling where you could lose your entire fortune in one night, heavy drinking, and lots of eating. There was a lot of binge eating going on. Marital seduction and adultery, not paying your tradesmen, going into massive amounts of debt, basically just generally not being that great of a person. Of course, the Jane Austen novel where we see that side of fashionable society the most is in Mansfield Park, where we do have a marital affair breakout. So much drama. Now, of course, we do need to remember that the fashionable elite were not one monolithic thing, but they were broken up into a more loose association of different friend groups and cliques. And some cliques were far, far more scandalous than others. And of course, with the Darcy Bingley clique, they are pretty chill and conservative when it comes to things like this. However, one among them that leans a little bit more this way is, of course, Mr. Hurst. The book talks about him this way. He's called a man of more fashion than fortune. He was an indolent man who lived only to eat, drink, and play at cards. Now, playing at cards was serious business back in the day, and very dangerous for losing large sums of money. In fact, in that scene, when Elizabeth is at Netherfield and she goes down to the drawing room to hang out with them while Jane's being sick, and she walks in and they're playing cards, this is what the book says. On entering the drawing room, she found the whole party at loo, and was immediately invited to join them. But suspecting them to be playing high, she declined it. So Elizabeth walks in and sees them playing Loo. Now, Loo was notorious as a game where you could lose your entire fortune. In fact, one Victorian-era writer wrote about it that this game, when unlimited, for there were 2 modes of playing it, was pretty and speedy a way of ruining a man as can easily be conceived. So this game of Loo was one that could bankrupt someone in one sitting, more or less. And so Elizabeth's looking at it and is like, yeah, I'm just gonna read a book. This is not for me. And it is very interesting because we all know it's Mr. Hurst who wants to be playing this game. Later, Mr. Darcy specifically says he doesn't want to play cards again. So it was Mr. Hurst over there being like, hey, let's play the game that might ruin us all. Now, of course, when it came to scandalous things, there was a massive double standard when it came to genders. Men could be far more scandalous and be just fine than a lady could. Of course, in Mansfield Park, we see the woman who's part of the adultery moment pretty much get kicked out to the middle of nowhere and kicked out of circles of fashion forever for that one. However, there still needed to be a little bit of spice to a lady's reputation. As one author put it, the reputation of a woman of fashion should not be too muddy, nor too limpid either. It must not be mere rock water or spring water, cold and clear. It should sparkle a little. So as a lady, you couldn't be too clear and clean. You needed a little bit of sparkle to your reputation and to your overall conversation skills. We see that's something else Miss Bingley and her sister really excel at is conversation and just being entertaining and generally sparkly when they want to be. We see Elizabeth notice this when she's staying at Netherfield as well. The book says, Elizabeth had never seen them so agreeable as they were during the hour which passed before the gentleman appeared. Their powers of conversation were considerable. They could describe an entertainment with accuracy, relate an anecdote with humor, and laugh at their acquaintance with spirit. Miss Bingley and her sister are just so great. They're fun, they're pretty, they're sparkly, and they're also incredibly fake, which was ironically another mark of those of fashion. In fact, being so fake and artificial was noted by one author as the manners of this people are remarkably artificial. They appear to do everything by rule, and not a word, a look, or a movement escapes them but what has one time or other been studied. It has indeed been remarked by nice observers that a dissimulation of their sentiments and their feelings is a feature in the character of this people which never forsakes them, and that amidst all the revolutions which their other habits experience, this master principle preserves an unchanging uniformity. Basically, it does not matter how much the ton changes, they will always be fake. That's the one thing you can always give them credit for, and which we see a lot with Miss Bingley. She's the one that gives us a lot of those very interesting quotes, like, oh, there's no enjoyment better than reading, when she doesn't care about reading at all. Or, I wish that conversation were the nature of the day rather than balls. Do you think she thinks that either? How much of what Miss Bingley says is actually what Miss Bingley thinks? This is the mystery. So those are the steps to becoming a person of fashion. Now, of course, this just all brings us back to, first of all, is Miss Bingley a lady of fashion? Now, I would say that she's probably on the periphery of this group. She is more than simply following trends. She hangs out with those that set them, and she helps amplify them. But at the same time, she did not come from a high enough birth to really be at the core central of this group. She is there at their discretion and pleasure, and they can kick her out at any moment they deem fit. And I think this leaves her with a lot of insecurity, which leads us to the other main question we're looking at here, which is, why is Miss Bingley such a mean girl? Miss Bingley is an early version of that mean girl, popular girl stereotype. She puts a lot of her self-worth and her life into being a lady of fashion and pushing down those around her who she deems below her or not fashionable, especially if they trigger her insecurity, which is what we see Elizabeth definitely do. First of all, Elizabeth is the daughter of a landed gentleman and inherently outranks Miss Bingley, just within their social world understanding. So Miss Bingley has to constantly drive home how unfashionable Lizzie is as a way of trying to appear superior to her in a different area of competition. She can't win on birth, but she can win on fashionableness. And of course, she is super insecure around Lizzie because, well, Mr. Darcy likes Lizzie, and while Miss Bingley likes Darcy, and I'm sure he's a great guy and very handsome, I think one of the main things Miss Bingley really loves about Mr. Darcy is his social position. That is what she wants. Yes, she wants the great estate at Pemberley, she wants the 10,000 a year, but she also wants some security. She wants to be firmly within the gentry and to come from such an elevated place that her social status is more acknowledged and locked in. And of course, this group that Miss Bingley aspires to and is part of is noted for being very artificial, very proud, very I'm better than everybody else, and that's inherently why I get to set the fashion, because everyone should want to be like me. And that, my friends, is why Miss Bingley is a mean girl, because high school never ends and it existed in Regency era London. Now, let me know in the comments down below, if you lived in the Regency era, would you aspire to be a person of fashion, or would you just be the fashionable people imitating them? Let me know in the comments down below. Remember to check out this video's sponsor, use my code Dashwood for 60% off an annual plan, and go to incogni.com/Dashwood to learn more. And as always, guys, keep being awesome, because you're awesome. Bye!